World Sailing published new racing rules in July, actually. I'd never heard about it. I just happened to look and see that they were there. And I spent a few days going through them. And there are a lot of changes in the World Sailing version. Just to be clear, World Sailing has published them. US Sailing has not yet added their prescriptions and published it.
Eric, does every country do their own prescriptions?
Potentially, yes.
And can you just highlight the reason why we have prescriptions?
For every country, there are things specific to that country, whatever the member national authority wants to do.
Can you give us an example of a prescription from the rule set? Verbally, don't bring it up in the book.
For example, Appendix U, the sound signal system, starting system, is a prescription of US Sailing.
Okay.
US Sailing prescribes that protest committee will not adjudicate financial damages, that has to be left to the insurance companies, and a whole bunch of other things.
Okay, thanks for the example.
For some reason, when I talk, my video doesn't spotlight. So
Yeah, we can tell you're a little distracted.
yeah, I was trying a few things to see if I could.
It spotlights when on my screen when you talk.
Oh, does it? Does it show me when I'm talking?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Well, it isn't doing it for me. Okay, then I'll leave that as it is. Okay, so there's a number of changes in the racing rules, a lot of them. I would guess over 100 edits were done to the racing rules. And I'm going to break it down into a variety of categories and only cover the ones that I think people are going to be interested in. Yay! The majority of the changes are rewording existing rules just to make them read a little better, make them easier to translate. For example, one of the rules has been renamed from tacking in the zone to passing head to wind in the zone. It doesn't change the meaning of anything at all, but it just makes the wording of the rules more consistent. There are a lot of changes in the rules that are interpretations of the rules that are in casebooks, in the casebook or in the judge's manual, that they have actually put into the rules themselves, so that people don't have to look in the judge's manual or don't have to read the casebook in order to see some of the important interpretations. So some of the rules have been fleshed out a little bit just to make them easier to understand. There's been a fair amount of reorganization where they've taken things in one part of the rule book and consolidated them and moved them to another part of the rule book, or have pointed you to somewhere else. For example, the definition of what is a spinnaker is no longer in the rule book. It's been pushed out into the equipment rules of sailing, and there's just a link saying, go read the equipment rules of sailing. A lot of the world sailing sailor categorization and other regulations, such as advertising and anti-doping and don't bet on things, and all that has been consolidated into a single rule that says, here's the list of regulations, and they're on the World Sailing website. Exoneration was in the current rules. There's 3 different rules that talk about exoneration. In the new rules, they've combined that all into one rule and renumbered it. So instead of having to look at rule 14 and 24 and 64, it's all in rule 43. So there's only one place to go for exoneration. Then there are what are actual changes that make a difference in how races are run or how they're sailed. And some of those changes are important to sailors and their support staff. And those are mainly what I'm going to go over. But there's also several changes that are very important for race committee. If you're doing race committee next year, there are some very significant changes to the rules. If you're on protest committee, there's several significant changes, but I don't plan to cover those tonight because not many of us actually spend much time on protest committee that they would recognize that the rules have changed even.
Are you planning on covering the race committee rule changes?
Yeah. And there are important changes for organizing authorities. Most importantly, the rules that cover what has to be in the NOR and what has to be in the SIs have changed. So every club, whoever is writing their NORs for the year and their SIs for the year, they're going to want to take a really close look at the new Appendix J, because a lot of the rules that used to have to be in both places now only have to be in the NOR. A lot of the things that had to be in the sailing instructions now have to be in the NOR. And they've added a new rule that says if it's in the NOR, it doesn't have to be in the SIs. So there's a lot of things like the regatta will be governed by the racing rules of sailing. That doesn't have to be in the sailing instructions anymore.
Is there any rule about having it in both places?
Well, the rules say, please make sure that there are no conflicts between them, but no rule forbids it from being in both places.
But the
I
goal
think it's
is
just
to get
generally better to have it in only one, because then you don't run the risk of making a mistake and misplacing a comma or changing the verbiage at all.
And also, we're trying to get to shorter SIs.
A friend of mine who's a judge has an ear in world sailing, and last year he told me that several things were going to be changing. Actually, it was more than a year ago. Anyway, he was saying that world sailing is really pushing towards getting rid of separate NOR and SIs. That's sort of their end goal. So they are moving towards having the standard sailing instructions, which are part of the rule book, and then a separate race document that will be, here's everything you need to know about it's going to be a combination of what the NOR is and whatever else you have to know about running a race that isn't in the standard sailing instructions. So the end goal is to basically eliminate the sailing instructions document. And they're moving in that direction by pushing more and more stuff to the NOR and saying that less and less has to be in the SIs. I'm not planning to go through that list, but if you're involved in publishing those documents, you're going to need to go look at Appendix J. Okay, in terms of...
Will the club have to do that for next spring and summer's championship season?
Yes.
Okay.
That will be governed by next year's rules. Anything that after January, except for Frostbite series that started this year and continue on into next year, will probably still be all under this year's rules.
You don't have to revise them for the frostbite category.
You don't have to change them for the Frostbite that's already underway or that will already be underway. But for the spring season, yes, the NOR and the SIs are going to need overhauls.
So U.S. Sailing adopts these, or they've already said we adopt these? Or
World Sailing publishes new rules every 4 years.
Yeah.
And that goes out then to the member national authorities, and the member national authorities can add their own prescriptions if they want.
When will the prescriptions be out, or do they?
I wish I knew.
Okay.
I'd like to see them out already. There are a few things that I haven't been able to find. For example, they've removed the protest form from the rule book, and they're replacing it with 2 new forms: a hearing request form and a hearing decision form. And that hearing request form will cover protests and requests for redress. Potentially also maybe even reports of sportsmanship violations and things like that. And also reports for penalties taken voluntarily, probably.
Yeah.
But that's not out on World Sailing's website yet, so I haven't been able to see what's actually in it. But I expect that U.S. Sailing should be publishing the new rule book within a month or two. Certainly within a month.
Yeah, they got to.
I mean, they've got to have it out October or November sometime. Quite frankly, I had expected them to have it already, but it
Yeah.
isn't there yet.
I Googled the internet, could not find any timeline for the US sailing prescriptions. Eric?
Okay. A few of the things that they've changed, let's start with the signals, the race signals, is if you look at the bottom right corner, they've added a new flag, the victor flag. I've seen this used in some regattas, but not for this purpose. But if you see the white flag with the red X on it, it means that the race committee wants you to monitor their hailing channel for safety instructions, safety and rescue. It's there in case something goes wrong and race committee needs to get all of the coaches and competitors and support boats involved in a rescue mission.
Okay.
Question,
So,
what about some class rules that prohibit radios?
well, if you don't have one, then you don't have to tune in. But it's everybody who has one has to.
So Eric, are you thinking that people are going to be using that when they abandon for a storm?
Quite possibly. Or if a storm comes in and people need to be rescued, or if somebody's in trouble.
Well,
You
in
know,
my
if-
judgment,
If somebody capsizes and they need help, then race committee might pop this up and say, hey, coaches, go over and help that boat.
Eric, go back
It's
up.
mainly intended for catastrophic scenarios, like a bad storm is coming in and they need to say, hey, we've abandoned the race, but all the coaches go grab people and tow them to shore right away.
Eric, go back up to the flag.
if people, if I'm sailing in a fleet that says I can't have the radio on while I'm racing, but I see that flag, I can turn my handheld on. I carry a handheld with me as a personal safety device, whether it's on during the race or not, depends on which fleet I'm sailing.
Yeah.
And notice,
And actually listening is, I think, generally not a problem, it's transmitting.
so notice the long bar after the arrow, so that means a loud horn.
A
Okay.
longhorn.
Sorry, a longhorn.
So Eric, would you expect this flag to be flown before the start of the race to indicate, or is this done at the time that they want to communicate?
It's at the time they want to communicate. It means if you see this flag go up with a long horn, then that means tune your radio to the communications channel because the race committee has instructions for you related to safety.
This may be beyond the scope of tonight's discussion, but can somebody explain to me why some classes don't allow radios?
Outside help.
Yeah.
Outside help in the days when radios were not as inexpensive as they are, it was considered an expense that they didn't want everyone to have to incur.
In our class, I believe it was for a level playing field because not all people could afford radios.
Right. Those, for the same reason they don't allow tactics on some boats or, you know, GPS on some boats, things like that. Those are all to try to keep competition fair by not allowing some people to have equipment on board that other people can't afford. But most classes nowadays are allowing radio, VHF handhelds on board or VHF radios on board because they are pretty inexpensive now. And they are a very useful safety tool.
I do encourage all dinghy boats to have one when you're out on the water, just for safety.
This means that, does this mean that the communication channel has to be published in the NOR or SIs?
Yes.
Probably.
Okay.
I think we're going to
they've
need
also-
to get one. I don't think we have a V flag. So put that on the list.
Right.
They've also defined the orange flag, and they've redefined the blue flag.
Oh,
So the orange flag is this defines one end of the starting line, and it says the staff. Unfortunately, not staff or halyard. That doesn't really change anything for us. It just makes it clearer. But they've changed the definition of the blue flag. The blue flag used to mean race committee is on station to take finishes. Now the blue flag means the blue flag is one end of the finish line. So
that
if you
means-
have a separate start line from a finish line, then the start line would have the orange flag and the finish line would have the blue flag.
oh, okay.
We might want to consider, if we have a combined start finish line, having both flags on one line or on one pole.
Oh, no, Eric, don't say that.
Ew.
How would we do
It just
that?
means don't fly the blue flag unless that is one end of the starting line.
Change the
For the
SI.
finishing line.
Finish will be an orange flag.
Does that mean
Well, unfortunately, these are part of the rules, and the race signals. No, I guess some of the race signals can be changed. Okay, so we could change this in the SIs, but anyway, these are going to be the standard meanings now.
And to the extent you don't change the rules, it's recommended.
Yes.
Even though none of us really want to finish with a blue flag.
Is it a possibility that the pin floats away and you stick a blue flag on a boat and designate that as the finish line as a replacement?
Holy moly.
Well,
And as if
generally, the
when
thing you would
short-
do if a mark disappears is you would send a boat over with an M flag,
Yeah.
which means this is the new mark,
So probably not
the mark
recommended.
that's missing.
This is the mark
I think-
that should be here.
I think this is mainly just for when you have a separate start line from your finish line, so that everybody knows that the orange flag is your start line and the blue flag is your finish line, especially if there's another course nearby with a start line, so that they don't
Okay.
confuse one finish line with the other start line.
If you
Well, that
shorten
could be-
course, what does the,
That could be helpful during the Governor's Cup.
Yeah.
Right. At the Governor's
Having a
Cup, for
finishing
example, you
boat.
could have a blue flag on the finish boat that is the finish line.
And we'll
And
get
that way it
yelled
would
at.
never be confusable with the orange flag on the signal boat.
Yeah, yeah. I can.
So, JC, you had asked about shorten, that would still be the S flag. Eric?
Yes. Okay, so let's move into probably what is the most important change to the rules for sailors, if I can get to it. Okay. World Sailing has changed the definition of start and the definition of finish. And they have made sailing the course a definition. They've taken what used to be in Rule 28, what we call the string rule. They've taken all of that text about how you sail the course and put it into a definition, which I think is really good because there's almost a dozen places in the rules that reference that. So now they all reference a defined term. And what they have done to the definition of start and finish is they have taken out all the verbiage of crew and equipment and whether or not they're in their normal position. So a boat starts when her hull crosses the start line. and she finishes when her hull crosses the finishing line.
So before Eric says more, anybody want to offer up what that means to them?
That means my bowsprit doesn't count anymore.
Correct.
That's right. Your
What else?
bowsprit can be over the line and your boat is not over.
Good luck fighting that one, but what else?
Your
The
spinnaker
spinnaker,
can be out in front of your boat and it doesn't count anymore.
Eric, let them do it.
Okay.
Alan, you were saying?
That's what I said. My bowsprit doesn't count anymore, just like the spinnaker.
So when you're citing a line for finishes, race committee, you no longer cite the spinnaker. That's going to be hard.
But also it means that my bowsprit can be over the starting line and I'm okay.
Yes, and if it's a downwind start, so could your spinnaker. But that's still going to be hard. It's going to be hard for race committee.
so Eric, is there a definition of hull? So it sounds like that doesn't include things like a bowsprit and a rudder that hang off the end?
Where's hull?
The hull is defined, actually, but it's defined in the equipment rules of sailing, not in the racing rules. And it does not include anything attached to the hull.
Thank you.
Is the bowsprit attached or an integral part of?
It's an attachment to the hull.
And where do we find the equipment rules of sailing?
Okay, well, the racing rules of sailing, including from World Sailing, including the document with the study version, with all the notations in it as to why the rules were changed, is found at sailing.org/documents/racing rules. There are other documents that are at sailing.org/racing rules/documents. And oh, I thought that the equipment rules were here, but they might be somewhere else. They're on the World Sailing website. I don't know the link at the moment. I thought I had it, but apparently I don't.
So if you just go to sailing.org/documents, then the equipment are a choice below.
Yes. Okay. But that defines things like what is the hull, what is the mast, what are spars, what's a bumpkin?
Okay, what is a bumpkin?
Does anybody know what a bumpkin is?
I'm assuming it's the sailing version, not the country version.
That's what I was going to say. It's the only one I know.
The nautical term. It's spelled the same. Or maybe it isn't. It's spelled B-U-M-P-K-I-N. Okay, digression. A bumpkin is a spar attached to the hull of a boat that extends off the stern of the boat.
So the backstay is a bumpkin.
What is a bumpkin?
Backstay?
No. The backstay is not a spar and it does not extend beyond the stern of the boat. If you have a yawl,
It's for yawls.
if you have a
or
yawl, then you have a bumpkin that goes off the stern of the yawl of the hull that the mizzen mast sheets to.
Say that 3 times fast.
That 3 times fast. Okay, but let's get back to the topic at hand. So starting and finishing, these definition changes are crucially important to race committee. And race committee is going to have to be retrained, because for years we have been training race committee to call anything over early at the start and to not call finishes until their equipment in normal position crosses the line. And there have been endless arguments in the judging community as what is a normal position.
So even though it's
So-
important for race committee next year, for sailors as well, who are aggressive and at the line, you know, you're gonna have to be able to defend your exceptions, because race committee is gonna be a little slow to adopt and change.
Right, if race committee calls you OCS because your bowsprit was across, you have to be prepared to request redress and train race committee to do it right.
That's gonna be a tough battle to win.
So if that happens to me, I'll continue racing and then worry about it afterwards?
It's a risky move, but yes. If you're
the
sure it's
stakes
your
are low,
bowsprit they called and not your hull, and you have good evidence that says that your hull was not over early, then you should keep going because you're not over early.
Yeah, but then it's my word against the race committee.
Yep, that's why I say you need some good evidence as to why they called it wrong. And for finishing, it's when your hull crosses, not when your bowsprit crosses or when your spinnaker crosses. So if you are neck and neck with another boat and your spinnaker is in front of theirs, but their bow is in front of yours, race committee should call them over first.
That'll be the tougher one. That'll be the one that actually gets interesting.
Can hear the screens?
Right, between a spinnaker boat and a non-spinnaker boat, there can be close calls that will go the other way now.
Yep, but in theory, that's all racing handicap, so it doesn't make a change in the final results.
Maybe, maybe not.
Yep.
Part of changing the definition of sail the course is that race committee now has the option, or not just the option, but if in today's rules, if you start and you finish, but you make an error in sailing the course, if you don't sail the course correctly, race committee has to finish you in your finish position and protest you for not sailing the course. That's how things stand today. Next year, that's changing. If you do not sail the course properly, race committee can score you NSC. It's a new scoring code, meaning you did not sail the course. And they can score you NSC without a hearing.
This is the first scoring code change in a long time that actually affects us at the club level.
So if I miss a mark and I'm not aware of it, it just, I just didn't finish.
The mark boat notice.
You
mark
start
boat
and you
notice
finish, but you just don't sail the course properly. And race
Doesn't
committee
count.
scores you didn't sail the course.
The mark
If you
boat
don't do
notices
enough laps, if you miss a mark, if you miss the offset mark and race committee notices it, then they can just score you NSC.
And
Just
so
like if you were over early, they score you OCS.
how does the
No
sailor
warnings. So
disagrees? Does he file for redress or protest the race committee?
Initially, he filed for scoring review. And if that doesn't pass, then he would file for redress.
We would file for redress. I think world sailing justification on this is there are going to be a lot fewer cases in which race committee gets it wrong than race committee gets it right. So it's actually going to reduce the number of hearings that we need in real life. So rather than race committee having to file protests against boats, in those instances where RC gets it wrong, the boat will request redress.
Alan,
I would-
Eric, if I'm in a mark boat and I see somebody fail to go
Yeah.
around the offset, am I expected to notify him? Do I just leave him alone?
Notify signal.
I mean,
Notify
notify, am I
your
expected to
PRO.
notify the sailor?
No, you notify your race officer, your PRO. You are expected to notify your PRO.
But don't give any notice to the sailor.
Let the PRO make that decision.
Eric, I have a question for you. There was a situation. Ellen, can you mute your computer, please? Sorry about that.
Ellen, I thought,
A boat did 1 lap instead of 2 and went off to shore. And Signal saw that, but didn't do anything. So when we got to shore, this person like practically finished the race first when they're usually DFL. And so I said, there's an issue with our fleet scoring. This person didn't even finish the race. And the Signal boat people said, yes, we saw that, we know that. And the judge said, you need to file a protest against that person. And I'm like, why do I need to file a protest? You guys saw it. So based on what you're saying, it sounds like RC should have filed a protest.
in the current rules, Stephanie, no, race committee is not obligated, but in the 2021 rules, my take is it's putting more obligation on race committee.
Okay. And the other misnomer out there are a lot of competitors that see people miss offsets and they just assume race committee, presumably the mark boat, is going to report that, but they currently do not. And I always tell the competitors, it's up to you to say something.
In 2020, yes.
It's always up to the
2021, it
competitors
sounds like-
to enforce the rules. Race committee may, currently, in the current rules, race committee may protest the boat, but they are not required to. If the competitors know he didn't sail the course and they don't protest, then most race committees will say, well, if the other sailors don't bother to protest, why should we?
But then there are situations where other sailors may not necessarily see it.
But there are
depending on-
situations, if I'm on race committee and I see something happen and there aren't any other sailors around to witness it, then I will take it upon myself to protest. But if there's a dozen other boats around who all see him miss the offset mark, then if you don't care, why should I?
So do we have enough staff on the racing committee to see everything? And is it not better to be just a big team that would report anything we see as we go or at the end? I mean, is race committee really able to see everything?
Race
Because
committee
it seems
should-
like in 2021, race committee will have more responsibility, but it seems like there are not that many people to see everything when
Race
there is
committee-
a big fleet.
Race committee should be staffed to run the event the way it needs to be run. So you've got the trade-off
well, this is-
between race.
Without getting into having the staffing issues, race committee in next year will have, if they see somebody not sail the course, they can just score them that way. They no longer have to protest.
Okay, one quick hypothetical question. If a boat crosses the finish line and realizes, oh, there's another lap that needs to happen and goes back and completes the proper course and finishes properly, is that, was their initial crossing the finish line prematurely overridden by the second crossing that was proper with the new rules?
Okay. In the existing rules and in the new rules, if you cross the finish line but continue to sail the course, you have not finished.
Thank you. That answers
You're
my
still
question.
sailing the course.
And for race committee, you should always record every time somebody finishes and then score the last one. Which is why we encourage racers to not cross the finish line after they've finished.
Okay, this is the major change for sailors for next year. There are a number of smaller changes that I'll get into. Have we covered this topic enough? Or does anybody have more questions about hull instead of hull and crew and equipment?
Well, you also told us about sailing the course and being scored.
and sailing the
did not
course.
sail the- That's a major one for sailors.
Okay, so let's move on to, there's been a change to Rule 2, fair sailing. Now, currently, if you break Rule 2, you can receive either a DSQ or a DND, which is disqualification non-discardable. They're taking out the DSQ next year. So anytime anybody breaks Rule 2, the penalty is going to be non-discardable disqualification.
And from my perspective, this is a don't care for club racing because we have never filed fair sailing against any of our members. Ever. There's never been any kind of protest for 2. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, at our level of don't care.
Jolene, are you saying there should have been such protests?
There should have been, but that's not what we are at the club level. It's more at
Okay,
the
the next
national
change
level.
the next change that is a change is probably not a big change for us either. They've changed Rule 16.2. There were some issues with this rule in team racing. It wasn't effective for some situations that came up in team racing. So last year, the World Sailing had an experimental rule to try to fix that. And it worked pretty well. So they are rolling that into Rule 16.2 next year. They're saying it applies on a beat to windward and passing
Eric,
to
you wanna
leeward
show
instead
something?
of passing astern. What, Jolene?
You want to show something? We're seeing you.
I'm seeing the course. I mean, I'm seeing the rules.
I'm
I'm
sharing
seeing the
the,
rules.
Okay, never mind.
okay, on a beat to windward, if a port tack boat is sailing to pass to leeward of a starboard tack boat, the starboard tack boat shall not bear away if as a result the port tack boat must change course immediately to continue keeping clear, is the new way. So it applies on a beat to windward, not just after the starting signal. And I don't think this is going to change how we play the game at all, except potentially there might be a short period of time before the starting signal if boats are on a beat to windward to the starting line when this rule would come into play. But I think that is going to be a very rare occurrence. So while this is a change, it's probably not one that is going to make a difference to us.
Alan, when you read this, what do you think? Because I haven't approved it yet, but I don't trust that assessment. This is just like too weird for me.
I can't think of many times that anyone changes course when I'm on port tack starting to duck them. But as Eric says, before the start, if I'm coming up on port and the starboard tack boat decides that they need to bear away for, you know, they're close to the line or whatever reason, it could potentially cause me to change course again. This is going to be a tough one to judge on the course.
I think the word there immediately is, you know, how do you determine immediately? If I want to come down, you have to change, but you have time to change. That's not, anyway.
Well, this
yeah.
is the so-called anti-hunting rule.
Right.
And at our level, you don't see hunting.
When I first
This
started
is not something that we generally, we do.
first racing, I was accused of hunting. I had no idea what was going on. And so I don't believe we can say anti-hunting doesn't apply to us. What was happening is I was fixating and following. I mean, because I was just like controlling the boat. So I won't say anti-hunting does not apply to what we do.
I know that hunting, to allow hunting hasn't been in the rules all that many years. It's been a while back, but it was a fairly recent thing that would allow you to change course down and come into what they say hunting. In other words, you see a port boat and you drop down to force them to attack. But yeah, and the shorter courses that we do, if you go down too far like that, you're going to be so far off course that it's not going to be any benefit to you.
But generally, it's not a good idea to do tactically anyway. So we generally don't do it. We do not.
I've seen the America's Cup.
We do not. When you're on starboard and the port tack boat is changing course to pass below you, we don't bear away and force them to turn away more. That's more of a match racing move than a fleet racing move. Match racing or team racing is more when you see hunting come into play. Okay, so the next significant change is in Rule 18.
Oh my goodness.
And it's when does Rule 18 turn off? And they've added to Rule 18.1 the text, Rule 18 no longer applies between boats when mark room has been given. So when you have given the boat the mark room that you owe them, as soon as you're done giving that room, Rule 18 shuts off.
Eric, that's got to change a lot.
If you look at what used to be in the rules, it used to say Rules 18.2b and c cease to apply if the boat entitled to mark room has been given that mark room.
So they just moved it up to be clear.
They moved it up, and also 18.2b and c are not the only parts of Rule 18. There's also Rule 18.2a. So there was, in the current rules, there is a strange case that can come up if sorry, I didn't pull that one up. I thought I had that one up. There's a weird case that can occur that once you have given a boat mark room under Rule 18.2b, as soon as you've given them that mark room, if that still leaves you on the inside, then suddenly Rule 18.2a kicks in and the onus of giving mark room switches, which is a really strange thing and nobody understands that. So they're taking that away. They're saying once you've given the mark room, the whole rule turns off, not just part of it. So this is a clarification and a simplification.
Alan and Jim, on your end, if you think about when you've given mark room, does this change anything for you?
I have not looked at this until this moment. Could you go back up to the first one that changed?
So there's no hail involved here, so it's just a common understanding when mark room is given?
But once, if a boat is entitled to mark room, or if one boat owes another boat mark room, is obligated to give them mark room, then as soon as they have, then the rule is completed and it no longer applies.
So this is basically applying to if I'm the boat that's entitled to mark room and the situation changes and you give me room and then I don't take the room, then I'm no longer entitled to it because I didn't take it appropriately.
No, it just means that it means that once the boat has given you that room, then the obligation ends. Once you have received the room you need, then the rule turns off. So you don't have to worry about how long do I have to continue giving him room? You know, what is he entitled to after he's passed the mark? You know, as soon as you've given him the room around the mark, that's all the room you need to give him. The
But is
obligation
that-
ends as soon as he's passed them, as soon as you have given him the room he needs to round the mark or pass the mark.
Does that provide me the opportunity at a lured mark to head up and close him off?
No,
If
but
he-
it means potentially you have the ability to head him up after you've given him room around the mark.
That's what Alan's saying.
Well, is that past the mark or before we've passed the mark?
Well,
I
if
think
he's,
Alan's first question makes sense to me. I've given him room. He doesn't take it. We're not around the mark yet. What happens now?
if a boat gives you room, then you may at your own risk take it.
Yeah.
If he does not owe you mark room, but he leaves you space, then you may at your own risk sail into that space, and that isn't changing.
That is, the question is, they give you the room, but you don't actually take it. They no longer owe it to you.
He bears away.
That's
and
not
then
what this rule change is about.
Eric,
This
can
rule
you bring
change
up
is how long do you have to keep giving him room?
Eric? Can you bring up your whiteboard with your little magic boats and give us an example?
just gonna ask.
Well, Eric's doing that. Stephen, what do you think about what's going on here?
Well, that he was talking about that. Yeah, if you could do the display, that would make more sense to me if you could do that.
But in general, just the overall, all the rules kind of stuff changing like this.
Yeah, I was going over looking at the equipment rules a little bit. I was trying to figure out in Appendix J. I was looking through some of that, and I'm just scanning it. But there's other stuff that like weights. You have to weigh your stuff. I didn't realize you have to weigh all your stuff. But I know it's getting too particular, I think, and it's just so we can have some fun, right?
Yep. So, I've been watching the rule changes since, since 2000. And it seems to me like, there was a major change back in 2000 that kind of changed a lot for people. But since then, there really hasn't been very much. But these rules changes seem to really create a lot of churn. Alan, what do you think?
I'm gonna pass on that question. When I started sailing, if you hit a mark, you were disqualified. So.
Master beam.
Master beam, no such thing as a 2 turns penalty. So there's lots of changes. I think for the overall part, the changes are good, and it's helped the sport evolve. And actually, it's simplified things. I really like the 3 boat length zone. But I think Eric might be ready to give us our demonstration.
Okay, well, this change is in response to people saying, well, how long do the obligations of Rule 18 last? Because if you look at the beginning of Rule 18, it says it applies blah, 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 and at least one of them is in the zone. So according to that, Rule 18 applies between them until everybody leaves the zone. So if you look at 2 boats approaching the zone, they reach it 3 boat lengths back, and Rule 18 continues to apply until not only have they passed it, but until they are both 3 boat lengths away. So technically, that's how long
Currently.
the obligation to give mark room exists. And there's been a lot of confusion about that. And a lot of discussion about, well, you still owe the mark room, but once you've satisfied it, then you've fulfilled the obligation. And even though the obligation is still there, it isn't meaningful. So they just wrote into the rules, once the mark room has been given, let's say these 2 boats were overlapped coming into the zone, and blue 2 has to give yellow 1 mark room, as soon as she's given her that mark room, then Rule 18 no longer applies. As soon as
So you're saying it really
as soon
doesn't
as yellow
change
has been given enough mark room to make it around the mark without touching it, then you no longer have to worry about Rule 18. All the question of, well, what happens from here on out to when we exit the zone, you just say, doesn't apply.
Most people, Eric, back up 2 steps. Most people would say they gain mark room 2 steps back. There you go.
Well,
Most
mark room
people
is
would
two
say-
things. Mark room is 2 things. One is to sail to the mark, and then room is necessary to sail the course while at the mark. And I think they actually added without touching it this year.
Is it
So
illegal
this
to
is
pull a-
still giving mark room all the way until you reach the point at which the mark no longer influences the boat's
Is it
course.
illegal to pull a Frank Meldown? Okay.
Huh.
Like if yellow 1 sits there, deliberately luffs the sails and sits there, forcing competitors around them, does he still have rights to be left alone?
There's no rule against doing that.
Okay.
For everybody else, Frank is famous for, normally if the first boat that's in, let's say he's ahead coming to the zone, and if he sails right to the mark, usually what happens is you come in really tight and then you wind up swinging wide on the exit. And that leaves a boat that was either outside of or right astern the potential of sneaking on the inside. And this is a common maneuver for the boat that's outside or astern. As he would, when they're coming to the boat or coming to the mark, so 2 would force 1 to sail right to the mark, not give him room to sail wide. And then while 1 was rounding close and entering close and exiting wide, 2 would swing a little wide so that he could enter close. And that is a legitimate tactic that we see a lot. What Frank Meldow is famous for doing in that situation, in order to keep somebody from sneaking inside of him, is he will come down to here and just park the boat and pivot it around the mark. Now that's very slow and it stops the boat almost dead in the water. But he stays there long enough that this boat finally has to commit to going underneath. And then Frank will sheet in the sails and reaccelerate, forcing the other boat to go wide.
It's easy when there's 2 boats, but if there's 5 boats behind boat number 2, it creates everybody shooting below them.
Basically, if there's more
Create
boats
a
involved,
traffic jam, a deliberate traffic jam.
by parking here and forcing this boat to come down, then he forces the next boat to come down and forces the next boat to come down. If you sit here and you park for a moment, then it forces everybody here to pinwheel.
Sucks
And-
to be number 2, green.
Frank Meldow is notorious for pulling that move. And that's
So-
legitimate tactics.
Let's go back to the original with just the boat 1 and 2. And you set that up that way. Let's put boat 2 ahead, but on the outside. So that changes the dynamic a little bit.
Okay, but assuming that they are overlapped at the zone,
Yes.
and they're coming in, then 2 has to give 1 mark room. That isn't changing. Okay, so what do you want to play out here?
Well, it's 1 comes down to round the mark, and 2 has to go a little bit more wide. I'm just wondering, I just need to visualize this. Is there, okay, I don't see how this could come into play. Well,
Oops, that's not mark room. That's not mark room. Barely. I think 2 would be ahead of 1 at that point, though, Eric.
okay, I just needed to see
Maybe,
that.
maybe not. Nothing has changed here except that once they get to this point, now instead of 2 still having to say, well, what do I have to do at this point because Rule 18 is still in force, he knows, oh, at this point, I've given him all the mark room he ever needed. Rule 18 no longer applies. We're done. Forget the mark. We're just back to windward leeward.
Until you
And I
just
think
said that about mark room, until you just said that about mark room continuing the 3 boat lengths beyond this point, never even occurred to me that that was the case.
Me either.
Right. Most
That's-
sailors
This is mainly just a
say-
clarification. Because
Right,
remember, it
so-
says it applies as long as at least one of them is in the zone.
So Eric, if you go back to the board, at that position, is 2 allowed to leave out 1?
Or head up.
Well, let's say that in the distant past, way back early on and before they reached the zone even, that 1 established overlap to windward of 2 from clear astern. Just to say, okay, so the proper course rule doesn't apply to number 2. Now, if, as you say, they are overlapped at the zone, but they are close enough that 2 is still ahead, then 2 has to give 1 mark room around the mark.
Isn't mark room.
But as soon as that mark room is done, there's nothing then that would prohibit 2 from luffing 1 up.
It's just 2 can't luff 1 up if you step back a couple net clicks. Can't luff
You
1
just can't-
into the mark.
Can't luff 1 up into the mark.
Thank you.
Okay.
But as
Yeah,
soon
that's
as
fair.
they're in a position where they're clear of the mark, all bets are off.
But doesn't that make 1 the leeward boat so that 2 can't luff him?
When 1's windward.
1 is still windward.
How? The wind is coming across the starboard of 2. Oh, well, then we weren't coming to the windward mark.
No, this was a leeward mark example.
Oh, it's a leeward mark. Okay. All right, that does change it.
Now, in the asking of this question, generally the scenario that was given was that the next mark is not a windward mark, but it's a reaching leg.
Or an offset.
Or this is let's say this is the Governor's Cup and this is the leeward mark and you've got a finish line over here somewhere. So coming to the leeward mark, number 2 would have to give number 1 mark room. But as soon as they were clear of the mark, 2 would be able to luff 1 up in order to protect her position to get to the finish line. And so if they came around like this, where 1 is now blanketing 2, 2 doesn't have to wait to get out of the zone before she can say, nope, I'm taking you up right here and now.
In the current rules, does 2 have to wait?
It's a gray area in the current rules, which is why they put this in.
Okay.
My personal opinion is this is not a change. Because once you've satisfied, in the current rules, I think once you have given the mark room, you have satisfied the obligation. And even though Rule 18 still applies, you have satisfied the obligation. You have given them mark room. But there are people who are still confused about that, so they put this sentence in just to try to make it clearer.
I think it's a question.
That's all
people
it
are
is.
confused. Rule 18 is so complicated for us that it helps clarify things.
This is just an attempt to say, hey, for everybody who's confused about when Rule 18 stops applying, this is it.
Not a question of confused. Rule 18 is a tough one. So Eric, what else do you have?
Okay, so let's move on to Rule 20. Oops, ran past it there.
We're close to wrapping up.
Does anybody know what Rule 20 is?
No.
Rule 20 is room to tack at an obstruction. And it's the only rule that requires a hail. Well, besides hailing protest. They've added additional requirements for making the hails. So if you need to hail for room to tack, instead of just saying room to tack and the other boat saying you tack or tacking themselves, they've added on when the conditions are such that a hail may not be heard, the boat shall also make a signal that clearly indicates her need for room to tack or her response. So if it's really
Such
windy,
as?
or if you're sailing boats that need a lot of room to tack, then you might have to make an arm motion. Or the notice of race, here it is in the notice of race, not the sailing instructions. The notice of race may specify an alternative communication. So the notice of race may say, if you need room to tack, you have to hail on the VHF radio. So if this was for a perf race, they might say, if you need room to tack, then you have to hail on the VHF, not just hailing verbally.
Wow.
So this is for
Wow.
conditions where, if it's really stormy and windy out and it's tough to be heard, or if the boats are, foiling boats and they're moving so fast and they need such a big area to tack in that they're just out of hailing distance, then you have to do something else. You need to somehow communicate that need in a different way. Okay, so
Doesn't
let's
really
move on to
apply
something, Jolene, that you will like.
Hold on, Eric. I have a question about the hailing for room to tack.
Okay.
Is there a certain verbiage that you're supposed to use to communicate the request for room to tack?
Let me scroll
What should you
back.
physically be hailing?
I'm from New York City. There's a certain verbiage that I use, but I'm not sure it's allowed.
Well, I've tried that and that doesn't work.
Well, there's not specific verbiage in this rule for the boat that is hailing for room, but generally you would hail room to tack.
That's only at an obstruction. That's not like a mark or
This is
something, right?
hailing for room to tack at an obstruction.
So how would that course of action
And
actually
the
unfold?
boat that you hailed to has to reply back, you tack. Has to either tack herself or hail you tack.
So you're kind of
So that's the
you're
hail you need to
tacking.
make.
Yeah, you're tacking, hoping that that boat actually does tack, or you're going to crash into them.
Well, no, not just that they'll tack, they slow down, they let you tack in front of them. So Jason, what kind of obstructions are you thinking of?
Well, at the Mayor's Club, I started on the port end of the starting line, and luckily it had rained heavily because we were running out of water. We were in very shallow water, and I was hailing to the boat next to me that we're going to run out of water here very quickly. It gets very shallow. We need to tack. And was not well versed enough in the nuances of how that worked. So I basically just slowed down and tacked in behind him, where he was saying, I'll give you the room.
Imagine you've started at the pin end of the starting line, and you're sailing on port tack towards the golf course at Lake Townsend. And this is the shoreline. And you're getting close to the shoreline, and it's getting really shallow here. And you're about to run aground. But there's another boat to weather and leeward of you that you can't just tack in front of, because he's on starboard, and if you tacked, you'd be on port and you wouldn't be able to cross him. So when safety requires it, a boat may hail for room to tack and then avoid a boat on the same tack. So when boat one can say, I need room to tack, at which point then two, the blue boat, has to either tack herself, or she can hail back, you tack, in which case she has to allow boat one room to tack. So she might have to then duck.
So Jason, all you needed to do was hail room to tack, and the other boat was obligated to respond, but they did not know that rule.
Yeah, I guess I just wasn't ballsy enough to tack in front of a brand new Scott.
Only do that if you would only do that if they tacked or they said you tacked. So they are supposed to respond, you tack.
They must respond. They must respond by either tack. When you say, I need room to tack, they do not have they must respond. They must either tack themselves or say you tack, and then allow you to tack and avoid them.
And so in that scenario, Jason, if they did not respond, then you've got to slow down and tack yourself and go behind them. And as you go behind them, you protest because they did not respond to your room to tack hail.
And that's the only way they're going to learn.
Yeah, I just felt like if I was in the position where tacking in front of them was going to create a collision, and I certainly didn't want that. But you're right. As I passed behind them, I should have then hailed protest.
Jason,
well, if you asked for room to tack and they did not respond.
Jason,
I believe they did respond, but I just wasn't comfortable pulling that maneuver.
So maybe if they said to you, so Jason, if they said to you, you tack, you would not have been comfortable to have tacked?
The way the boats were, the way we were oriented, if I tacked, he would have have to be very, very quick in order for me not to hit him. And I guess I just wasn't willing to risk two boats.
So that's wrong on your part.
That is not the topic of our discussion tonight, and we're running long already. So can we?
Thank you for that clarification.
Postpone that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Jolene, here's one that you will like. Let me just switch back. And it's Rule 41. You remember what Rule 41 is, Jolene?
Propulsion? No, that's 42. Outside help.
41 is outside help. They've changed this rule a couple of times in the past few rule books. And in the last rule book, they put in this text right here that says that a boat that gains significant advantage in the race from help received under 41A, and 41A is help for a crew member who's ill, injured, or in danger. They put in last time, if you gain a significant advantage from receiving that help, then you may be protested and penalized. And World Sailing decided that this was not a good idea because they had situations where people had fallen overboard or had capsized in very cold water. And because they were afraid they would be disqualified if they received help, they told race committee, don't help us. We're going to climb back into the boat ourselves. And that became potentially a safety issue. So now if you fall overboard in winter sailing and race committee picks you up and puts you back on your boat, that is outside help for a crew that is in danger. And that is a form of help that is legal. So race committee can help crew who is ill, injured, or in danger without forcing the boat to be penalized.
I like
So
that
not,
rule.
not something we encounter at the club level.
Well, it is something we have in winter sailing.
Heck, I death rolled in OBX and our boat, we were 15 seconds from the finish line and couldn't get back in the boat when we righted it, and it sailed off upwind without us. So the safety boat had to pick both of us up, and by the time we got to our boat, it was a half mile back upwind while we dove on it. So stuff happens in a high wind.
Mhm.
Okay, there's been a change to Rule 42 as well, the propulsion rule.
So Eric, at what point do you wrap this up?
Well, we're getting close to the end of my notes, and I really want to try to push through it if we can.
Okay.
They've changed when you can pump a sail. It used to be that you could not pump a sail on a beat to windward in order to initiate surfing or planing. But in the way they've written the rule last year, where they've defined surfing as accelerating down the front of a wave, they're allowing you to do it upwind now, but only if that's the front of a wave. So in the rare case where you have a wave that is traveling upwind, either because the seas are opposite the wind or it's a motorboat wake, you actually can pump your sail in order to initiate surfing on a wave that is moving into the wind.
Doesn't affect us.
We don't sail boats that do pumping. They've also put in this next year that you can pump in order to initiate foiling. And in order to initiate foiling, you're not limited to one pump.
Doesn't affect us.
Okay, so on to 47. You remember what Rule 55 is?
Trash.
Okay, it's been renamed Rule 47 in the new rules from renumbered. And they've extended it to apply to support persons as well as to competitors. But they've also made it, if you look at Rule 86, they've added this to the list of rules that sailing instructions and notice of race may not change. So if you do not like the trash disposal rule, you're stuck with it.
Too bad.
You can't modify it.
But race committee can put trash in the water.
But we never do.
Ha! An apple core is trash, JC.
Aren't race committee support people?
No, they're
No.
not. Okay, Rule 48.2, if you leave the boat, whether intentionally to swim or unintentionally by capsizing or falling overboard, currently, you must be back on board before the boat continues to race. Next year, you merely need to be in contact with the boat.
You can be holding on
So-
to it.
If it's, say, a downwind or downcurrent finish and you capsize right in front of the finish line, as long as you're hanging onto the boat and the boat drifts across the finish line, you've finished. You don't have to be on board in order to finish. Likewise, if you capsize on a downwind leg and your boat starts drifting, as long as you're drifting with it and you get it back upright, you can get on board and continue sailing. You don't have to get on board and then go back to the point at which you fell off before you continue to race.
Nobody would have done it anyway.
Okay. For those of us who use a trapeze,
Peter, are you asleep?
No, it's
Somebody else is snoring.
they're putting back into the rules. They're putting back into the rules that your trapeze harness has to have a quick release device on it. And that device has to be ISO 10862 compliant.
So Eric and I are probably going to have to replace our trapeze harnesses.
Well, this ISO standard was created in 2009. So if your trapeze harness was made after that, there's a good chance it complies with the ISO certification, the ISO standard. But I don't know whether my own trapeze harness complies with that standard or not. And I don't have a good way of telling whether or not it does. I've looked online to see, does my harness comply with the standard? And I simply don't know. So those of us who use a trapeze and have a harness are going to have to dig in and find out whether or not our harnesses are ISO 10862 compliant. And if not, we'll have to go get new harnesses.
Is that it, Eric?
Okay, I'm going to cover just a couple of more rules. In order to do this quickly, I'm not going to try to scroll down. I'm just going to say it. But right now, if you request redress because of injury or damage caused by another boat that was breaking a rule, you don't have to protest them first. You just have to determine in the redress hearing that they broke a rule and thus caused the injury or damage. They're changing that next year such that you can only get redress because of injury or damage if the other boat either took a penalty voluntarily or was penalized. So if you are in an incident and somebody on your crew is injured or your boat is damaged, and that causes you to lose place in the race, you have to protest the other boat.
Or if you want to file insurance.
Or that other boat has to take a penalty.
But Eric,
Something has to happen to cause that boat to be penalized before you are eligible for redress.
Eric, wouldn't you have to do that for insurance? Wouldn't you have to do that?
You should do it for insurance purposes anyway. I mean, but just let's say, you're sailing along and somebody fouls you and you have to crash tack and your crew falls down and injures themselves, breaks a finger or something, and it takes you a couple of minutes to splint it before you continue racing.
Yeah.
You might not report that to your insurance company, but if you want redress for that time lost because of the injury, you have to protest the other boat and win that protest. Or the other boat has to say, yes, I broke the rule and I'm voluntarily taking a penalty. Okay. Also, if you break a rule, this is a new rule, if you break a rule that is a discretionary penalty, let's say you put trash in the water intentionally, that's a discretionary penalty rule. You should now report that to protest committee when you get to shore. And then they will convene a hearing and decide what penalty to impose. So it doesn't require a
Not
boat to
happening.
protest you, but if you know you broke a rule and it's a DP rule, then instead of saying I'm retiring, you can just go to protest committee and say, yeah, I broke this rule. What's my penalty?
The typical one is when you are required to check in before racing as a discretionary and you don't, and you know you didn't.
Right. If you didn't check in, or if the event had some sort of report when you return to shore rule, which they do for junior regattas or something like that. If you forgot to and you realize that when you come to shore, then you can just say, race committee, or not race, protest committee, I forgot to do this. I broke this rule. Please convene and tell me what my penalty is. Rather than my being forced to go to race committee and say, I forgot to check in, so I have to retire. Okay, well, we're at an hour and a half on this, and there's a bunch of other stuff about scoring and reopening hearings and things for protest committees that I don't think we really need to discuss. Like I said, the big one is the definition of starting. It's all about hulls. Starting and finishing is all about the hull, OCS, I flag, black flag. That's all about hulls now. And that's the biggest change that we're likely to actually have an effect on us as club sailors. And race committee being able to score somebody as did not sail the course without having to have a protest hearing. All the other things are small and the rest of them are mostly just reorganization. So any questions? I hope that's been useful.
Thanks, Eric. Another great session.